The reading I never took is the one I can still recite. 42. Not bars, not anything I'd written down. Just the number of seconds I shaved off the grouting pass to keep the schedule honest. And a schedule is a kind of god men pray to with their hands. Water stood ankle-deep on the invert that night, brown and patient, carrying the smell of wet cement and rust. The pumps were losing. 2 of them ran, 1 had seized at shift change, and the 3rd coughed like a man with salt in his lungs every time the float switch dropped. My HUD smeared the dark with its usual confidence. Strata banding in green, the crown plotted in soft amber, the grout volume ticking up cubic meter by cubic meter as the rig's injection ports fed the annulus behind the segments. Numbers I trusted. Numbers I'd earned the right to trust over 19 years of reading rock by the way it sweated. There was a window on that overlay I had learned to read without reading. Pore pressure, top right, a small, honest figure that told you what the ground wanted to do when you weren't looking. I let it scroll past. Piotr was on the injection gun, 22 years old and proud of his welds, calling out volumes in that flat radio cadence I'd drilled into him myself. Marek ran the pumps. The Lehman boy, I never used his first name, none of us did, he was just the kid, held the laser target steady at the face while the slurry came up over his boots, and he laughed about it, because at 23 the water is a joke and not a verdict. 6 men, my night shift. I signed the pass on the slate with 2 thumbed taps. Grout, set, proceed, and the green confirmation washed across my eyes like a blessing I had paid cash for. The crown spoke first. It always does. A dry tick high up in the amber, where the segment ring met the unconsolidated muck above, 1 pixel flickering from green to a color the manual didn't name. Then the pressure window I'd ignored went red, and the figure inside it was a number I will carry to whatever they weigh me on. 11. 11 seconds between the tick and the give. I have measured that span 10,000 times since, in heartbeats, in pick strikes, in the slow drip off a stope ceiling, and it is never long enough to do the thing I did and also the thing I should have done. The crown let go in a single soft exhalation, no thunder, just the ground deciding it was tired of being held, and a wall of gray slurry came down the running tunnel the way the tide comes for a flat beach, without malice, without hurry, filling everything that was lower than itself. Marek went under at the pumps and did not come up. Piotr I foresaw for 1 second, mouth open around a volume he never finished calling, the gun still in his hands. I had the hatch. I want that on the ledger plainly. I was nearest the cross-passage door. I had the air on my back and the clearance to make it, and the math was already done before I knew I was doing math. 1 man out, certain, or back into the throat of it for whoever was still kicking, certainty unknown, return unlikely. I went back, not for love, I didn't have the time to call it that, for arithmetic. 6 in, 6 out. The brigade comes up whole, or the foreman doesn't sign anything ever again. I found the kid by his hand. He had it raised through the slurry, like a man hailing a tram, finger spread, the laser target still strapped to his wrist and pulsing its small red eye up through 2 feet of liquid stone. I got my fist around that wrist. I pulled. The grout had the weight of every cubic meter I'd cheerfully watched tick upward, and it took him by the legs and took me by the chest, and the 2 of us hung there in the dark while my HUD blizzarded into static. The ceiling pressing down, the overlay screaming snow, every honest green number gone to noise because the rock was finally close enough to touch my face. His grip outlasted his breathing by a few seconds. I felt it. The fingers I was holding loosened 1 knuckle at a time, the way a rope pays out when you've stopped believing in it, and the last of the give was so gentle I mistook it for him pulling free on purpose. I held the empty hand anyway. That is the only warm thing I did that night, and it warmed no one. The slurry closed over my mouth at a temperature exactly that of the river the city drank from, which I noted because noting was all that was left to me. 6 men. The number sat in the dark with me, while the cold did its slow accounting and the static behind my eyes thinned. and thinned, and went perfectly, finally still. Then the brand on my collarbone began to burn, and a voice that was not water counted me. The salt came up my throat before my eyes would open, and I coughed it onto stone that was warm where a body had lain dying on it before mine. Brine, not river water. The river I drowned in tasted of rust and diesel, and the cities poured concrete, and this was something older and meaner, a mineral burn that scoured the back of the nose and left the tongue feeling sanded. My hands found the floor. They were not my hands. The fingers were too long, the calluses sat in the wrong places. A young man's grip, soft across the palm, hard only along the inside of the thumb, where some other life had hauled rope it never finished hauling. I counted my own breaths because there was nothing else to count. One that tore, one that whistled, one that held. Someone had dragged me down into the lowest stope by the heels. I could feel where the rock had peeled the skin off both shins, two parallel scrapes weeping into the dark, and the cold of being deeper than anyone bothers to dig for any reason but punishment. A man with a lamp on his brow stood over me and said a word in a language I had never learned and understood anyway, the way you understand a load horn 3 tunnels off. The word meant, "Lie still." He pressed an iron to my collarbone. I had time to think the shape of it, a stamp, a die, the kind you'd use to mark sleepers before they go under the rail, and then it bit, and the meat of me sang one clear high note while the smell of my own searing came up sweet and wrong. 3 numbers went into me with the heat. 4, 1, 3. I did not scream the way the body wanted to. 19 years of holding a face that is about to spall teaches you that the noise spends air you will need later, and air, down here, was already the only currency I could feel myself being short of. So I bit the inside of this stranger's cheek and bled into his mouth and held it. The brander grunted, almost approving, and moved his lamp away, and the dark came back in like water finding a low place. When he was gone, I lay in it and did the arithmetic I always do. 1 lamp, leaving. No lamp, staying. A gallery I could not see the end of, the air in it thick and still and faintly sweetish with the breath of how many men I could not say. The ceiling was close. I knew that without measuring, the way you know a man is standing behind you. The weight of the rock leaned down on the small of the dark and pressed, and the old static started up behind my eyes. The snow, the white nothing that had been the last thing I saw before the grout took the kid's hand out of mine. I put my palm flat against the wall to stand. That was all. A man getting up off the floor, the way 10,000 shifts had taught him to, hand to the rib of the tunnel to find which way was upright. The wall answered. A green line woke under the salt, faint as the first filament in a cold bulb, then another, then a lattice. Strata laid out in honest bands across the dark behind my eyes, the way I'd drawn them on slate for 19 years. A halite seam here, a clay parting there, a shear plane running off at 11 degrees that the rock wanted to slip along the moment anyone gave it the room. The overlay smeared itself across the black and steadied. Every figure I had ever trusted came back to me in a stranger's skull. Vault stress, top left, the load percentage ticking as my own weight shifted the floor. Pore pressure, top right, that small, honest window, the one I let scroll past, lit and waiting for me to read it this time. And lower, in the corner where I had always kept the number that mattered most, oxygen. 61% of what a man needs, and falling, in a gallery the church had filled with 412 men already counted as spent. My old rig was dead. I had felt it die under the slurry, watched it blizzard into snow against my face. It had no business here, in this body, under this salt, under a sky I had not seen, and a God I did not believe in. But it woke when my hand met rock the way a horse wakes to a familiar harness, and it laid the whole murdering ground out in front of me in green, every weakness tagged, every load named, the road out drawn in numbers I had spent 1 crew learning to read, and would spend my last breath earning the right to read again. 6 men had gone in with me, once. 6 had not come out. I stood in the lowest stope of the Theocracy's salt, branded 413, the static throttling down to a hum I could almost hold, and understood the thing the cold had been too slow to teach me. I had not been killed. I had been reissued. The readout held for exactly as long as I kept my chin down and my eyes on the floor, while I read the salt like a slate, strata in honest green bands, the 11-degree shear tagged and ticking, vault stress crawling 1% higher each time a man shifted his weight 3 galleries over. The ground made sense the way a survey makes sense, which is to say, it did not care whether I lived, only whether I could keep my hand against it and stay quiet and let the figures do the arithmetic of the load. I built the model fast. Old habit, soldered into a stranger's hand. Halite over clay, parting over halite. A brine lens swelling somewhere off to my left, like an abscess under a jaw, and the poor pressure window lit in the top corner, patient, the small, honest number I once let scroll past unread. This time, I read it. Then I looked up. That was the cheat, and that was where it broke. The ceiling had not moved a finger's width, but my eyes found how close it sat. A palm of rock I could not see, and could feel, leaning on the lid of my skull. And the white came up through the green and ate it. The strata bled to snow. The shear plane bent to 40 degrees, then to 100, then to a glyph I had never been taught and could not stop reading. Load percentages spun like a meter with the needle torn off. Vault stress went to symbols, the symbols went to static, and the one figure I had built my whole dead life around, oxygen, the number that decides whether 6 come out, smeared to a white bar, and then to nothing at all. Snow piling on snow. The slurry pressing rock to my face, 400 meters under a city that did not exist anymore and never had. I lost it. The whole instrument, the whole god of green lines, drowned in the same blizzard that had taken the kid's hand out of mine, and I lay in the lowest stope with my palm flat to a wall that was screaming something at me in a language of numbers I had just gone blind to. Breath at panic. Useless. I knew the count and could not spend it. Hands took me under the arms before I had it back. 2 overseers, salt crusted to the elbow, indifferent as a cold front. They handled me the way I once handled spoil. No malice in it, only tonnage. They walked me to the face. A ring was set into the salt there, hammered through a steel plate. The plate bedded in resin that had run and gone hard in a frozen drip, and they passed a chain through a loop welded to my collar and snugged it until the cold link kissed the new brand, and the brand answered with its one high note. I knelt where they put me. The face was an arm's length off, close enough to lick. And with the chain set and my breath coming back in ragged thirds, the count steadied enough to let one clean fact through the snow. The air down here was thick and sweetish and still, the breath of a great many men who had stopped using theirs. I had heard the brander say a word that meant the third gallery. I had felt, before the panic took the model, where the green ran out. A wall of figures simply ending, the way a survey ends when the men it measured do. 412 of them, counted and spent and stacked into the rock as fill. I was the 413th. And the drift that had killed them, the shear and the brine lens and the poor pressure window that nobody read in time, I had drawn that drift on slate in another life, signed the bottom of it, and let it go forward. The same failure, the same 11 degrees. I had surveyed this grave before, in a body that drowned for it, and the church had buried 412 men in my old mistake, and then issued me the number that came after. I pressed my forehead to the salt to stop the spinning, and the wall, even with the model gone, even through the white, pushed one last reading up through the bone of my skull. Not in green now, but in something blunter, the way you feel a load come on before a timber so much as groans. The brine lens was charging. The clay parting above the face had gone slick. The pore pressure in that small, honest corner had crossed the line I knew by heart from the last time I ignored it, and the sheer plane wanted the room the overseers had just changed me into. 11 seconds. That was what the crown had given me, once, between the first tick and the give. I knelt against a face that was beginning, very quietly, to make the same arithmetic, and I was the only man in 400 meters of salt who could hear it count. Something came down the drift that did not cough. I knew it by the stride before the lamp cleared the bend. Even unhurried, the walk of a man who had never once weighed the air he spent against the air he had left to spend. Down here we moved in thirds. Breath, hold, breath. He owned his whole lungful and meant to keep owning it, and that told me, before I lifted my chin a forbidden inch off the salt, exactly what he was. Two came. The first carried a brass lamp on a pole and a wax board hung from his belt. The board scored deep with a stylus and rubbed smooth and scored again. 100 tallies layered over each other like growth rings in a felled stump. Pit boss, cartel man. He read the gallery the way I once read a spoil heap, by weight, by what it would fetch, by how much could still be made to move before the cost of moving it crossed the line where you bolt the door and walk. He never looked at the men. He looked at the salt the men were chained to, and reckoned. Behind him, no lamp. A censer instead, swinging on a chain, leaking a sweetish smoke that fought the dead man air and lost. The robe was salt white and salt stiff, the hem crusted into a fringe that chimed faintly with crystals where it dragged the floor. The priest of the vault did not reckon. He blessed. He went down the line touching each forehead with a thumb wet from a brine flask, and to each chained man he gave the same flat liturgy, that salt was the world's first mercy, that it pulled the rot from meat and the sin from men by the one holy thirst, that suffering in the deep was not waste but a washing, and the more a body was ground against the rock, the cleaner its account stood in the only ledger that outlasts a man. The cartel's tally swung from one belt. The vaults he carried behind his teeth, and it never showed a figure, only a verdict. The pit boss said a number up at him. Yield off the upper vein, I think. Climbing. The priest answered with the word the brander had used, the third gallery, and drew over it the sign you make above a thing already finished. There the two trades met and shook. Upper vein paying, deep seam spent, wallet. The model was gone, but the blunt sense of the rock still pushed up through the bone of my forehead, and the brine lens off to my left was still charging, and the clay, parting above the working face, had gone slick as the belly of a landed fish, and the small, honest pressure I knew by heart had crossed its line, and the priest stood square under the worst of it and called the place consecrated, untouchable, a stretch of rock no pick was to bite because the vault had ruled the suffering inside it complete. The number under his sandals did not care what he ruled. 61 and falling. I had a thing I could have said. 11 words, fewer than the seconds I was holding. The partings let go. Back the men off the face. I felt the shape of it load up behind my tongue. The old reflex that signs a slate and stops a shift before the crown comes down. And I understood, kneeling with the brand still ticking its high note, that not one soul in that procession was built to hear it. To the boss, it was a quota whining for mercy it hadn't earned. To the priest, it was a slave choosing his comfort over his cleansing, which is sin, which is more reason to set the wall, not less. The rock spoke in arithmetic. They had raised a whole faith to mishear it on purpose. Then the priest lifted the censer and named the work they had walked down to do. A crossing. A procession to pace the third gallery end to end with smoke and water and verdict. To consecrate the spent men where they leaned and lay the wall while breath still moved through them. An act of faith costing the vault nothing and the cartel a door it wanted shut regardless. Holy and cheap. The two ledgers love each other most exactly where they touch. So I knelt at the face with two powers agreeing over my skull, one that priced men as stock and one that sold their suffering as soap. And beneath both of them the rock kept its own quiet count, brine charging, parting greased, the 11 degrees patient, a tally no scripture would read and no quota would pay to be told. One life I had spent signing the slate that drowned 6. This one they had issued me to kneel under 412. Measurement was the only prayer I had left, And measurement, down here, was the heresy that got you bricked in fastest, which left the figure I could not set down. If the single truth that could empty this gallery alive was the one truth both my owners were sworn to silence, how does a chained man make rock speak louder than God? The censer smoke thinned down the drift until the air stood honest again, and I went back to the only work I trusted: counting. The man 2 chains to my left breathed wrong. Short at the top, a hitch and a catch, lungs that had worked a face with no draft for years and learned to ration the part of each breath that actually fed him. Deep stope trade. I'd crewed men like him before, the ones who came up out of bad ground and never breathed all the way down again, chests gone shallow as a sump that won't drain. He didn't look at me. None of them did, the first hour. Looking cost air, and air was the only coin nobody could chain to your collar. So I looked for them, the deep stope men you marked by their hands, knuckles swollen to walnuts, fingers half closed and set there, frozen in the curl of a tool until the hand was the tool's shape and not its own. One graybeard had worn a groove in the salt at his knee from the same small rocking he must have done across 10,000 shifts to keep blood moving in his legs. And I knew that figure cold, 10,000 shifts, because it was the length of my last life laid end to end, the exact measure of a man spent against rock. He'd survived by going small. They all had. The deep takes the loud ones first. Between the broken sat the rest, and those I read the way you read core samples, for what they'd been before the salt took them. One man's forearms carried old burn scar in the spatter of forged throws. Another's palms were ribboned with the fast, clean cuts a rope leaves when it runs too quick through a grip. And I looked down at my own new hands then, the 2 long fingers, the soft palm, the single line of callus inside the thumb from a rope this body had hauled and never finished hauling, and understood I'd been issued into the same lottery I was now reading off everyone else. Trades, sleeping in ruined men, smith, roper, mason, counter, a whole work's worth of craft, chained down here and told its only skill now was to suffer well. Then the watchers. You find them in any works where water is rationed and trust is sold by the cup. The ones whose skins hung fuller at the hip, whose collars sat a half-link loose, who studied the chained the way the pit boss had studied the salt. Trustees. One sat near the drift mouth with a clay flask he didn't share, and a habit of turning his head toward any voice that rose, cataloging. He'd trade a man's whisper for a swallow, and the cartel would pay it gladly, because a mouth that informs is cheaper to keep than a guard who walks the line. I marked him, and the flask, and the quick listening ear, and filed him where I'd once filed a fault that hadn't moved yet but would. Not malice. Plumbing. Water ran downhill to him, and lives ran the same channel. What had killed this gallery, I read off the geometry before I read it off the corpses. One way in, one way out, the out half choked with spoil. No second heading, no return airway, nothing to make the air walk a circuit and carry its poison off. Dead-end ground. The 400 had been packed into a pocket that breathed like a corked jug, each lungful spent and handed back, the good of the air drawn thinner shift by shift until a flame, had they owned one, would have lain down in that pocket like a dog told to stay. Choke damp. Not the vault's holy thirst, not salt drinking their sin from the inside. A ventilation problem. They had died of a thing any second year on my old crew could have fixed with 2 arrows and a fan chalked on a slate, and no one in this dark owned the 2 arrows. That was the whole of it, kneeling there with the brand cooled to a dull tick and the survey gone dark behind my eyes. The priest read the rock as God and blessed its killing. The boss read it as stock and priced its killing. The trustee read the men and called it supper. Every power down here looked at the salt and saw a will to bargain with, a thing that wanted, a mouth with an appetite. And not one of them saw what it actually was, which was a system, dumb and patient and bound to laws it could no more break than water could choose to climb. I was the only man chained to this face who knew the rock held no opinion of us at all. That made me the one heretic worth the cost of a wall. I set my palm flat to the salt and began, quietly, to survey the dead, hunting the single thing two ledgers had agreed could not exist, a way for the bad air to leave. 412. He came down the upper drift on a measured line, the master surveyor, and the first warning of him was a smell that arrived before the man: soap, dry wool, water spent on washing instead of drinking, a luxury so foreign down here that 3 heads turned toward it the way a sprout turns toward a crack of sky. Sounding rods rode bundled across his back, brass shod, scored at the foot in increments. He did not look at us, he looked at the air. Tilted his head the way a herring gull cocks to read a gust off the water, tasting the wrong moving draft that bled out of our corked pocket, and I watched him stand at the drift mouth and triangulate the void off an oversaline sump and the lean of a flame no one had lit. And I knew, the way I'd once known a crown was already lost by the note the rock sang back up a drill string, that here was the single mind in this dark with craft enough to undo me. He planted a rod, struck it once, read the answer through 2 fingers laid flat to the haft. Then he said it. Not to me, not to the 400, over us, the way a man calls a grade across the backs of mules. Seems spent. The wax board quit its scoring. He named the figures the way I'd have named them, cold and right. Yield falling off a shelf, salt gone soft and weeping brine. The cost of holding open ground that gave back less each shift than the timber it swallowed. Wallet when the upper vein squares its quota. Stocks exhausted. His thumbnail dragged once down the soft wax of the boss's tally, a single line through a column, and that was our whole funeral, crossed out. 412 men and the rock that held them, smeared to a stroke a thumb could close. It landed in the new body, heat climbing the throat, the bitten cheek flooding again where I set my teeth. I did the only useful thing, which was nothing. A scream spends air, rage spends more and slower and leaves you owing. I held both behind the brand cooling on my collarbone and let the shame run down and pool where I could reach it, because a thing measured is a thing you can spend later, on purpose, in straight lines. He'd done me a kindness without knowing its shape. A man who means to seal you tells you, by the telling, when, and he had handed me a schedule. The upper vein squares quota. Weeks, a season. I'd learned the rate by counting ore that went up and never came back down. Then they wall the deep and walk, and the morning they stop watching the dead seam is the morning the dead seam turns into the safest hole in the salt to dig from, because no pit boss wastes a guard on stock he's already crossed out. Their neglect was a hinge. They would build me a door and stencil "tomb" across it. I turned it the way I'd turn a survey before I let a single bit bite. Slow, from every face. The gallery that killed these men, dead-end ground with one choked mouth and the air handed back and back until it lay down like a dog told to stay, was the worst place in the works to keep a man breathing, and the best place I'd ever stood to start a boar nobody would come hunting. The fault that drowned my 6 at least had the decency to announce which way it meant to move. This salt wanted only to close, to weep brine across any face I opened and heal the cut smooth behind me. A wall that mends its own wounds also hides them. The plumbing that strangled 400, cut and turned, would breathe a tunnel long enough to crawl out the far end of. I let my palm find the cold, and the dead rig woke its ghost across the dark. The 11-degree shear, the brine lens swelling like a held lungful, the paleo channel I'd half-traced running off into rock no cartel rod had ever struck. The surveyor could smell my dig from a wrong draft. He could not smell a heading I hadn't cut yet, through a face that resealed itself behind me into a blank he'd read as solid country and never sound twice, give or take the lie folded into my own arithmetic. A road for a man with the days and the lungs and one heretic certainty that salt holds no opinion and can therefore be argued with. 400 meters. Call it 400. So I made the only promise the dark would honor. Not aloud, not to a God who blesses killers or a ledger that crosses men out, but to the figure. They'd cut me a window, I'd hang a door inside it. The throat that emptied these men of air, I would recut into the throat that carried them out. Every breath the upper vein robbed off me, I'd rob back as survey, in palm spans of cold and percentages counted down. And I would not sign proceed until the rock itself said proceed. Never again on 42 stolen seconds. Never again over an honest warning I had read and chose to bury. 6 in, 6 out had been my old arithmetic, and I'd failed it by one entire shift. This count was longer. 412 in, the same out. Hold. Salt keeps a different secret in every grain, and the trick is making it confess without a God standing between you and the rock. I worked the face alone in the dead hour, when the deep stope men slept the way men sleep who ration breath. Shallow even, owing nothing to dreams. My pick was half a pick, the head sheared off at the eye, good for tapping and nothing else now. I laid it to the wall and struck light and listened. The salt sang back. Not the dull thud of choked ground, but a thin, sustained note, the pitch of a wet glass rim run by a finger, climbing where the rock ran clean and dropping flat where it didn't. And I held the haft in 2 fingers the way the surveyor had held his, and let the answer travel up the bone instead of the ear. 10,000 shifts had taught me to hear granite lie and shale tell the truth. This was easier. Salt has no patience for secrets. A priest would have called that note the rock's own voice and knelt to it. The boss would have priced it. I broke a corner off and put it on my tongue because eyes lie in lamplight and the mouth does not. And I needed neither blessing nor figure, only the data the salt was too honest to keep. Clean halite first, bright and square, a cold burn that quit fast. Then the bitter underneath, the soapy sting that meant magnesium had bled into the bedding, the soft weeping bands the surveyor had crossed out with a thumbnail. I spat. I worked the face a span at a time, tasting, building a map in salt and spit that no cartel rod would ever sound. Bitter here, clean there, the grade of the poison written on the backs of my teeth. When I set my palm flat, the dead rig woke and threw its ghost across the dark, bedding planes stacked like the leaves of a book left out in the rain, every page swollen and still legible, the 11-degree shear running its slow diagonal through all of them. Low down, a thread of black, a clay parting, finger thick, laid flat in the white the way a seam of grief runs flat under a year of ordinary days, and I read it twice before I let myself trust it. A floor. Clay would hold where salt wept, it would not heal, and it would not soften, and a man who cut along its top edge would have something under his knees the brine couldn't pull out from beneath him. The church had buried a road in its larder and never once felt the shape of what it walked on. Above the parting, the overlay swelled and went the color the old rig kept for water it wanted me afraid of. The brine lens. It sat behind the upper face like a held breath behind a paper wall, and the surveyor had smelled its sump 3 galleries off, and still never guessed it carried a belly this size. I traced the underside with a thumbnail in the dark, following the rig where it drew the water thinning, and found the place it pinched out above the clay. A hand's width of dry, sound country threading between the swollen water and the weeping salt. The one lane in all that poisoned rock where I could drive a heading and not drown my own night shift the way I drowned the last 6. Route under the water, ride the clay, let the salt close behind me. My hands did the arithmetic the way hands do, without asking. 2 long fingers, a boy's, spidering the face for the change in grain. The soft palm reading cold like a fever off a forehead. The single callus inside the thumb, raised by a rope this body never finished hauling, catching where the salt went from glass to weep, and telling me so before the eye could. I pressed until the brand pulled tight and hot across the collarbone. 413. I let it pull. A body is an instrument too, and this one was new to me, and I would learn its drift the way I learned the drift on every machine I ever ran, by trusting it a degree less than it asked to be trusted. The afternoon spent itself in taps and tastes and the small dry music of a face that did not want to kill me and would not care if it did. I had a floor. I had a lane. I had a water I could walk under instead of into, and a salt that would seal my cut into blank country behind every shift I stole. Then the half-pick found the note I hadn't known to listen for, a low hollow under the clean, 3 spans left of where I knelt, the seeing gone round and open, the way one tunnel answers a knock, another tunnel can hear. The paleo channel. Not a half-traced ghost on a dead rig now, but a real void breathing on the far side of the wall, close enough to taste on the draft, running exactly where I'd counted it would run. 400 meters. I had the first one. A tallow flame at the back of the gallery stood no higher than a fingernail, and a flame that won't grow is telling the men asleep beneath it a thing none of them has been told. I watched it lean. Yellow burned down to a low blue stub, bowing toward the one weak draft like a dog toward a shut door. The vault read that color as devotion, the holy thirst, the rock drinking back the light it was owed. I read it as a number falling in the low corner of a window only I could see. Choke damp doesn't roar, it pools. Heavier than the air a chest goes hunting for, it lies down in the dead end of a heading and waits. And it takes the strong ones first, because the strong work deepest and breathe hardest and drag the poison down into themselves fastest of all. 2 men slept at the low wall who would not have woken hungry. I had counted their breaths from across the floor, slow and then slower, the gap between them widening the way a gap widens just before it stops. 11 a minute, then 9. The old salt cutter found me with my palm flat to the wall and my eyes shut, and he did not ask what God I knelt to. He asked what I heard. I told him there was sound rock 3 spans up and dead air down here, and the 2 of them wanted introducing. He had cut salt for 30 years and lost the tally of the men he'd carried out by the wrists. He looked at me the way you look at a tool you have not yet decided is sharp. I cut a winze, not a wide one, a throat barely a shoulder across, angled up through the 11-degree shear toward the gut of the worked gallery overhead, riding the clean band the salt sang back to my pick and quitting cold wherever it wept. The old man set his blade beside mine without a word, cut where I scratched a mark, left rock where I left none. 2 nights of it. Salt came down in plates and fist lumps and the bright glass that burns and quits on the tongue, and we hauled it out in our shirts and packed the spent end tight so the new throat had one mouth only and breathed where I told it to. Heat lifts air. Air carries breath. The law is older than any altar and asks no man to suffer for it. At the foot of the winze I laid a small fire of tallow-soaked rope and fed it slow. The cut throat above it became a chimney, the warm air climbing it the way warm air has always climbed. And at the gallery's wide mouth, I hung a rag soaked in brine, a wet wall, a curtain, low gap left open along the floor. Cold, good air had one road now. In along the floor, across the sleeping men, through the dead end, up the burning throat, and gone. I kept the fire starved against the damp cloth, so it sipped the air instead of swallowing it whole. The stub at the back lifted, a fingernail, then a thumb, then a clean, straight tongue of yellow standing off the wick the way a flame stands when it is fed, telling the whole gallery the air had turned before I said a word of it. One sleeper coughed, drew, coughed and turned his face into the new draft the way a man turns toward an open window in summer. And his lips, gone the slate of wet ash, came back by degrees to the color of lips. The men who had been told for years that the closeness at their throats was the hand of God now stood in moving air and felt the hand lift. Nobody knelt. They came 1 and 2 at a time, put their faces in the draft and breathing, looked at me, not up the way you look at a saint, but level. The way you look at a foreman, waiting on the next thing he'll ask for. I asked for hands. They gave them. The dogma had never been malice. It was only a man pricing rock he had never once put his palm against, calling his ignorance a sacrament because the word cost less than the fix. The old cutter did not thank me. He wet his thumb in the soot at the chimney mouth and pressed it to my collarbone, over the 3 strokes the church had burned there, 4-1-3, and held it a beat too long. I understood that I had been claimed, and that the claiming carried freight. Fire underground has a smell. The trustee would walk this heading at the change of shift and find breathable air where holy thirst was scheduled, find a throat cut into the rock no quota had ordered, and somewhere up in the light, a priest who read suffering as the toll on grace would learn that someone in the dark had stopped paying it. I had bought 2 men there next morning with the only secret I had left worth spending. 2, breathing. 1 trustee's round from the question I had no lie ready for. Every seam keeps a direction it would rather travel, and it is never the one chalked on the overseer's board. I found ours in the dead hour, chin down, eyes on the floor, palm flat where the green model held steady, vault stress bleeding its slow numbers in the top left, pore pressure ticking in the corner I once ignored and now court like a debt, oxygen guttering low and right. The salt to the east rang hard and proud and full of the vault's holy water, a wall I had no business loving. West, it lied differently. West, the tap note came back soft, a half-tone flatter, the sound of rock that has been wet once and never forgets it. And when I set my tongue to the seep, the taste was old river and not the bitter brine the church bleeds for tithe. A buried channel. Stone laid down by water before any altar stood in the light, then drowned in salt and lost. Soft ground, drainable ground, ground that tilted up toward air the way a dropped rope hangs toward the floor it wants. 400 meters of it, give or take the lie every estimate carries. I tallied the distance in pick strikes and the gradient in the slow climb of the load against my skull, and I did not let myself want it yet, because wanting is how a man shaves 42 seconds and signs his shift into the gray. Then the ground taught me its price. Where the channel necked down to a crawl, I went in on my belly. The ceiling came close, and the green model died in my eyes like a lamp dunked in a bucket. The instant my chin lifted to read the rock overhead, the snow took it. White static eating the survey, the numbers, the clean lines, everything I had been issued back out of the grave. Blind in the close, heart going like a trustee's fist on a door. I shut my eyes against ground I could not see anyway, set my palm to the wall, and let the load come up through bone, blunt and wordless. The one reading the snow could never reach. I counted. Pick strikes, not breaths. The crawl held at a span and a half, and I lived through it on touch and came out wet to the waist and shaking, knowing the close ground would be back, every meter of the way, a flaw I could not cut out of myself. So I made eyes I could send where mine went white. I took the men the draft had woken and the ones the old cutter vouched for, and I taught them the only catechism I trust. Palm to salt, read what pushes back. Tap with the pick butt, learn the note that means sound and the flat note that means wet. Hold a flake on the tongue till it bites and quits, then tell me how fast it quit. One had hands quick enough to count my strikes louder than I could. I made him my tally. Another could crawl the necks I balked at, and I taught him to lay his cheek to the floor and call me the load in the numbers I drilled into him, so that where the green snow blinded me, his flat young voice came down the throat like an instrument I could read. 12 of them, not one could survey. All of them, between them, could be a survey, and that was a thing no overseer thought to forbid, because no overseer believed a brand could think. We dug west behind a lie. At the mouth I cut a plug of the hard east salt to the shape of the wall it stood in, dressed its face to match the worked rock, and learned the trick the old cutter showed me without a word. Brine eats salt, and brine remakes it. A bucket of the church's own bitter water, poured slow down the seam, dissolved the plug's edges to nothing, and married it to the living wall, sealing the join to a hairline a trustee's lamp would skate right over. We let it dry. It set hard as the rest of the heading, no seam, no shadow, no breath. To open the drift, we wet the line again, and the false face wept loose into our hands. To close it, we wet it once more, and the salt healed over our going the way ice heals over a stone dropped through it. Behind that face, I cut the first meter of a road on no God's map. 1 meter. Soft ground, tilting up, breathing river air 400 from here, the salt ceiling behind us each dawn as though no man had passed. I marked the depth on my forearm with a wet thumb where the brand could not read it. 3 strokes for each meter against the 3 the church had burned there, and I was counting the second in my head, palm flat, listening the load up through the skull. The tap note changed. 3 strikes, far off, deliberate. The spacing of a man who knows rock and is putting a question to it. Someone in the dark was tapping back. Salt going to nothing in a sump makes a sound like sleet finding a slate roof. Soft, then all at once, then a hiss that thins to silence as the water takes what it can hold. After that, the water lies. A tailings pile is a confession any trustee can read by lamplight. The tonnage of a hidden drift written in the heap a man leaves behind him. So we left no heap at all. Every barrow of cut west salt went down into the church's own tithe sumps, and we stirred it under until the lens drank itself heavy and syrup slow, and would swallow no more. And what it refused, we scraped and carried off to the spent faces, where spill meant nothing to anyone. Saturation has a number. I keep it on my tongue. I had not answered the rock. The 3 strikes sat in me like a stone swallowed whole, a question put by a hand that knew its trade, and I owned no air to spend on questions yet. So I marked the hour and turned back to the work that keeps a man breathing. That is the only kind of answer I have ever learned to give. Soft ground does not wait on a foreman's nerve. The west channel wanted to close the way a cut wants to close, slow and patient and certain, and left unshored, it would have taken the road back inside a week, and the 12 of us with it. Timber here is dearer than bread. We stole it the way you steal seconds off a grout pass, a prop lifted here, a length of lagging there, splintered off the cartel's own pit sets and tallied against requisitions that would never come. And where no timber reached, we braided instead. Salt rope twisted 3 strand from unraveled grain sacking and cured stiff as horn in the brine, lashing cap to post where nothing else would bite. The load came up through my skull at 60 and climbing. I set the props to meet it. The deeper the bore ran, the worse the air went, and that I knew in the bone before any instrument confirmed it. Knew it in the count of 412 who learnt it the hard way. Choke damp pooling in the low cuts where spent breath settles and goes dead, and a flame browns before a man has the sense to be afraid. I built a lung for it. Stitched hide, sinew sewn, the seams paid over with rendered fat, a bellows near the size of a butchered hog, worked by a boy on a plank treadle, pushing air down a line of jointed reed to the face where I cut blind. The flame told me what the oxygen corner of my dead HUD could never reach into the tight dark. Yellow and tall meant dig. Brown and low meant back the men off and pump. The vault sells thirst and calls it holy. I gave my men air and called it nothing. In the close ground, my eyes are worse than worthless. The green model snows to white the instant my chin lifts to read the ceiling. Numbers eaten, clean lines gone. An instrument that betrays a man by simply going blank. So I went back 1,000 years to find tools that cannot lie by emptying. A cord knotted at the fathom, paid out hand over hand, gives me length no static can blizzard out. A lamp slung on a plumb line gives me grade, its hang red against a notched stick, telling the channel's slow climb toward open air at 1 part in 40, rising, always rising, the way I had promised the rock it would. Measure twice, trust the knot over the ghost. We cut and drowned the spoil and shored behind us, and at each dawn the false face wept loose, took us through, and healed shut over our going, while the trustees counted ghosts on the dead seams roster. I read the knotted cord at the end of every shift. Then I wrote the day on my forearm in wet thumb strokes, well below the 3 the church had burned into my collarbone, where the brand could not read the count that mattered. The road west had a length now, measured and proved, climbing toward a breath of old river no altar had ever blessed. 8 meters. The boy on the treadle could keep the flame yellow for the span of 200 strokes before the air at the face went thin enough to brown it. My tally counter could hold a count past 1,000 without losing the thread. The crawler laid his cheek to the floor at the necks I balked at and called me the load in the flat numbers I had drilled into him, an instrument with a pulse, reading the dark where my green light died. None of them could survey. Between them, they were the survey, and no overseer thought to forbid a thing he did not believe a branded man could build. The lung breathed, the salt sealed. The 3 strikes waited in the wall, patient as the water that laid this channel down before there were priests to bless it or pit bosses to wall it off. And each shift before I set the pick, I laid my palm flat to the west face and asked the load what it carried. The load I could read. The other question I could not put to my own 12. When a hand you will never see knocks twice on the only door you have, do you knock back, or do you cut faster and pray it is not a trustee learning to tap? I knew the arithmetic of names. Carry 6 of them in your mouth long enough, and they stop being a shift roster and turn into a debt you cannot settle in air. I had learned that with gray slurry climbing a boy's wrist and his fingers letting go 1 knuckle at a time, and I had sworn off the practice the way a burned man swears off open flame. So I held the 12 at their numbers as long as the dark allowed. The dark did not allow it long. It started with the treadle boy. 200 strokes was his honest measure, and 1 shift he gave me 240 before the flame so much as browned at the edge. And when I went to mark the count on my forearm, he told me his name was Pavlo. Said it flat. Reported it the way you report a load coming up through the bone. I wrote Pavlo where the number should have gone, and the digit went under the name, and that is how a kingdom begins, not with a crown, but with a man deciding 1 syllable is worth more than 1 stroke of chalk. By the 3rd week, the dead scene kept a clock no altar had wound. The crawler was Yeva now, a woman who read the floor with her cheekbone, sure than my green ghost ever read it lit, and she stood the low necks I balked at and called the load up to me in the flat numbers I had drilled into her skull. We ran 3 shifts against the trustees too. Lookouts at the false face learned to cough a code, 2 dry, 1 wet, when a sandal scraped the roster gate, so the pick went still and the bellows dropped to a sleeper's breathing before a tallyman ever rounded the pillar. We were quietest when we worked hardest. The wall taught that. A kingdom eats, and someone has to count what it eats and despise the counting. That fell to a one-eyed salt hauler the others called Old Marta, who hoarded tallow ends and reed joints and brine-cured rope in a slit behind a fallen pillar and would not yield a finger of any of it without a reckoning chalked against the work it bought. She rationed harder than the vault did, fed the lungs fat seams and the lamp's wick out of the same dwindling stock, and weighed every draw against the next. I loved her for it. The way you love a prop that holds at 90 and does not crack just to warn you. She gave me what the rock allowed and not a dram past it. The old cutter had set his blade beside mine for 2 nights without a word, cutting where I marked, leaving rock where I left none. On the 3rd, he did the thing that made me his. He wet his thumb in the slick at the chimney's lip, that cold, mineral sweat the salt weeps where the air goes over, and reached up and drew it down across the 3 strokes the church had burned into my collarbone, not to cover the brand, but to damp it, the way you damp a tool before you trust your weight to the swing. And he said nothing at all, because 30 years of carrying men out by the wrists had taught him that some claims spoil in the speaking. I held still under the thumb. He weighed me one last time, like a tool he had finally decided was sharp. Then he took up his blade and went back to the cut. Then a woman in the upper gallery went into labor in the dark we were all digging to drain. No midwife, no water the vault had not first blessed and taxed and measured into a tithe. Old Marta went up with a hank of brine rope and a tallow stub, and the rest of us kept the only worship I have ever trusted, We held the flame yellow and the air moving so the low cut where she labored would not pool dead while a new pair of lungs tried for its first pull. I bled the bellows line west. Robbed my own blind face of 200 strokes an hour and did not chalk the theft on my arm, because some counts you carry without writing them, the way you carry the men under the crown you signed. The child came out blue. He did not stay blue. He had no number. The church had not reached him yet, had not burned a digit into a collarbone smaller than the span of my two thumbs, and for the length of one held breath, he was the only soul under 400 meters of salt who owed the ledger nothing at all. I counted the gallery in my head the way I always count it. 12 who survey. Old Marta, the cutter, the mother, the lookouts, the haulers who give their hands at the false face each dawn. And now, one more. Slick and furious and pulling air down a road I had cut him before he had a name to cut it under. 13. I had held a hand going empty once. A boy's, the gray coming up over the both of us, the fingers slackening while I counted the seconds I had stolen to put us there. This one was the opposite arithmetic. It closed around my finger in the lamp dark and pulled, blind and certain, the grip of a thing that means to stay. And I stood there in the bad air, doing the only sum that mattered. How much further west, how many meters of climb, how much breath between this fist and open sky. I wrote nothing down. I carried it anyway. 10 meters west, the floor gave back lamplight it had no right to hold. Brine, sweated up through a hairline I had not chalked, pooling cold in the low cut where Pavlo treadled. I knelt and put my tongue to the slick before my eyes were done arguing. Bitter, soapy, the magnesium sting that means the bedding has split somewhere overhead and is bleeding its poison down. Not the clean halite I had married into the false face, but the other thing, the rot that rides ahead of water. 2 fingers to the haft. I tapped the back of the cut. The note came home drowned and short, swallowed before it could finish ringing. The overlay woke the one red I had spent 2 lives not looking at. Top right corner, pour pressure. The window I let go dark while a crown loaded over 6 men who trusted the schedule I signed, lit amber and began to climb. An 11-degree sheer above me, and behind it, a lens of brine the seam had been holding the way a fist holds water, which is to say, not for long and never on purpose. I had drawn this exact failure on a clean desk once, in colored pencil, and crossed it out to buy back 42 seconds. Now it sat over Pavlo's head. Off the neck, I said, and they moved, because the names I had given them outranked the church's chalk. The partings let go. Back the men off the face. 11 words I have carried since the gray came up over a boy and me, and the first time in 2 lives a room was built to hear them. Yeva went flat to the wall and read the floor with her cheekbone and called the load up to me in the flat numbers I had drilled into her skull. Rising, she said. I set the first prop while the rest scattered to old Marta's slit for timber and salt rope. Then the slab let go, and the dig tried to become the one thing I am most afraid of. Brine came off the sheer in a sheet cold as the inside of a bell, and the lamp drowned to a coal. Salt in my collar, in my mouth, the low neck filling around my knees, the roof talking in that long, grinding vowel that is not sound so much as weight changing its mind. The green went to snow, all of it. Stress, pressure, the oxygen counting itself down in its corner, smeared into a blizzard of dead pixels, the instrument blinding me at the exact second I had built my whole survival on its eyes. And under the snow, the only thing left running was my own breath, going ragged and faster, each pull dragging the static thicker while the gray rose in memory to meet the brine rising at my shins and a boy's fingers loosened in mine all over again. I was drowning standing up. The walls came in to the span of my own ribs, skull to rock. I drove my forehead against the salt the way the old cutter had found me that first day, palm flat and eyes shut. And under the snow, the rock still spoke its blunt, wordless load. A press, a lean, the whole tonnage of the roof reporting through the bone behind my eyes where no static could reach. The instrument lied. The bone did not. I could not slow the breath. The harder I chased it, the worse the snow boiled. So I quit counting breath altogether. I counted strikes instead, reached up blind and tapped the prop head with the half pick. 1. And the storm in the green dropped a notch. 2. The number lived outside me, even and dumb and mine to set, and the readout followed it down out of the blizzard the way a spooked animal follows a steady hand and never a kind voice. 3. Each strike a peg driven through the panic into the floor. 4. The breath could riot all it wanted. I was not listening to the breath. 5. And the snow thinned to a smear. 6. And the load red swam back up beneath it, the amber window steadying enough to show me a falling trend. The lens was emptying itself into the cut, draining, not loading. The worst of it already past me and running west for the tide sumps I had dug to swallow exactly this poison. I called Yeva back to the floor by name and the cutter to the long prop, and we shored into the wet on the count and not the fear. Salt rope round the timber wedged into the corner of the sheer. Every blow landed on a number I said aloud so the others could stand inside it too. Old Marta fed us reed joints from the dark, one for one, weighing even this against the next. The roof took the props, and leaned, and groaned, and held at the count of 40. We knelt in brine to our wrists, and breathed the moving air I had robbed off the face and never chalked. I read the floor once more before I trusted my weight to it. Tap. Listen. The drowned vowel had gone hard again, the magnesium run off down the road I cut, the clean haylight ringing under it where the seam had decided, for tonight, to stay. Pavlo bailed the last of the wet with a cracked tallow pot, two-handed, saying nothing. The cutter looked at the held roof, then at me, and waited the way he weighs a prop at 90, sound, and not to be trusted past it, and good enough to keep men under till morning. The fear did not leave. I took its gauge. A thing measured is a thing you can spend later, on purpose, in straight lines, and I had finally measured the worst of mine and found it ran on breath, so I would feed it strikes instead, and keep the count, and hold the roof. 40. 2 fingers to the tongue, and he had us. That is how I built it afterward, from what old Marta hauled down in the meal baskets, and what the rock confessed on its own. The master surveyor crouched at the lip of the number 4 tide sump in the clean light of the upper works, dipping 2 fingers, reading the water the way I read a floor. No rod for that first reading, the sump ran wrong. Bitter where the church's blessing water should have come off it clean, the soapy magnesium sting of split bedding bled into a cistern that had no business tasting of any wound. And a man who has put his tongue to 10,000 sumps does not argue with the one that has started drinking from somewhere it was never plumbed. I gave him that. Every shift I drowned my spoil in those sumps to keep my meters off the chalk, and every shift the poison I buried climbed a finger higher into water the cartel measured for tithe. I had weighed it and spent it on purpose, in straight lines, a fouled cistern up top against 40 held meters down below, the arithmetic still balanced. The cost had only come due sooner than I priced it. He found the air next. Marta said he stood at the third gallery's mouth a long while with a thread of toe fiber on a wetted finger, watching it lean. A working should breathe out where the men breathe in. Mine breathed the other way. The bellows lung I had stitched from hide and reed pulled a cold draft west toward the paleo channel, so the tunnel exhaled where it ought to have drawn. A finger's worth of wrong moving air, the kind of thing a pit boss walks straight through for 20 years and never once feels on his neck. He felt it. He has spent a life with his cheek to the dark, and the dark told him a room down here was breathing that his own ledger swore was dead. Then the rods. I heard him before Marta finished her telling. Forehead to the salt at the false face, I caught a note that belonged to no load I knew. A hard, clean, struck iron ringing that walked through the bedding and arrived behind my eyes like a tuning fork dropped down a well. Tap. A pause while he read the echo back. Tap. He was driving a sounding rod into the gallery floor and listening for the honest ring of solid stone, and wherever his note ran on too long and came home soft, he would chalk a hollow. 2 stations. 3. The void boxed between them by the time the salt finishes answering. He was doing to the rock the exact thing I do. The rock answered him the same as it answers me, owing neither of us a thing. The pit boss could not have found me in a year of walking the drifts. The priest reads thirst and tonnage and nothing under them. This one is built different, and the difference is the whole of the danger. He is the man who crossed our seam off as exhausted stock with his own hand, sealed and abandoned in his ledger, and now his own nose has started telling him the corpse is breathing. A lesser surveyor trusts the figure over the draft. He trusts the draft. He will trust it all the way down to our props if I hand him one more shift of reversed air and one more sump gone sour over his tongue. So I sat in the dark and took his gauge the way I take the roofs. How fast a rod walks a gallery. How many sumps I can let foul before the pattern points like a finger laid flat on a chart. I could thin the spoil I drown and dry stack the rest behind the false face and choke my own meters to a crawl to do it. I could throttle the bellows on his shifts and let my men breathe shallow so the draft hangs slack. I could feed him a clean cistern or two to argue against his own mouth. Each dodge bought hours and cost air or meters or both. The ledger does not let a man buy without spending, and it never has. That night, I lay forehead to the false face long after the others slept and listened to him work. The note came again, nearer than before, then again, nearer still. I marked his strikes off on my forearm in wet thumb strokes the way I tally meters, 3 to a station, counting his road toward us as carefully as I count my own away. And somewhere between the 4th ring and the 5th, I understood that the survey running west to drain 400 men into clean air and the survey running east to find them were the same survey now, read off the same salt, racing through the bone of the same dark toward the same hollow. 2 stations placed, he needs only one more. Marta's basket came light that morning, and the weight she carried instead of bread was the day they meant to wall us. She would not say it in words. She set a thumb of mortar grit on my palm, the gray, lime-bitten kind the masons mix up top and no downshift ever touches, and folded my fingers over it, and that was the whole of the telling. The vault does not write its accounts where a slave can read them. It keeps the ledger behind the teeth, a verdict and never a sum, and the verdict on the 3rd gallery had stopped being the surveyor's quiet business and become the church's. A crossing was coming down. They had named it weeks back, drawn it off the calendar when the upper vein ran its quota short, and now set it marching again on a date Marta could only press into my hand as a pinch of someone else's mortar. I knew the shape of one without being shown. You feel a crossing in the bedding before a single lamp clears the ramp, a tread that belongs to no working, slow and even and many, kept to a hymn the salt carries down clean as a note off a struck rod. Inquisitors lead it, swinging censers packed with the holy thirst. Behind them, the zealots haul the consecration block, the lime, the long iron the masons drive to set a final course, and they walk all of it down to a gallery the church has judged spent, and they close the mouth of it with stone, while the men inside still breathe. Mercy, they call the closing. Doctrine swears it. Salt was the world's first mercy, the vault holds, drawing rot from dead meat and sin from living men by the one holy thirst. And a body ground long enough against the rock comes out with its account scrubbed clean. So the deeper a man suffers, the brighter he is spent, and to seal him in the salt is not murder, but the last entry that balances his book. The men carrying the lime believe that. They think they are doing the kindest arithmetic there is. That is the part of them no measurement reaches. Mine had stopped paying. There was the tripwire, sprung at last, and I had set it myself without knowing the wire was live. A priest reads a gallery by how hard it suffers. Suffering is the toll, and a seam gone quiet has quit the tithe. Word climbs faster than air. Some censor man at the 3rd gallery's mouth had felt what the surveyor felt, a deep that breathed where God ordained it choke, men not dying on the clean schedule the doctrine priced them, and the church has only one answer for a room that refuses to suffocate. Come down, finish the choking by hand. 2 notes to count now, where last night there had been 1. East, low and hard and patient, the surveyor walked his rod toward us a station at a time, a man who had thrown our seam away in ink and then followed his own nose back to it, paying the rock no faith and collecting none. Above, slower, a society slower, the crossing came down the ramps with its hymn and its iron, and it did not have to find anything, because it already held the door. It was only marching to a place it had drawn on a chart and meant to fill with stone and breath and call the filling holy. 1 survey hunting the hollow, 1 procession coming to pack it. I lay forehead to the false face and ran both clocks the only way I trust. Surveyor, 2 stations down, 1 to go, a shift and a half at the rate his rings closed. Crossing, heavier, slower on the ramps, but it owed no hunt. It walked a road already cut, straight to our lid. I weighed the shorter against the heavier, the rod against the hymn, and set the figure where I set all of them, flat, against the meters of tunnel I had left unfinished to the west. Call it 30 hours. 30. The cruelty of it sat in my chest with the clean, dead weight of a load reading. They would come down singing across the very floor I had spent a season draining, set their block on bedding 10 meters above a paleo channel running cold and sweet toward daylight, and kneel to the salt's tapped note as the voice of their own God, and never once feel the shape of the road I had buried in their larder, never feel the draft moving under their knees, the 100 meters of patient theft breathing west beneath the spot they stooped to close. They would consecrate the lid of the thing and march home satisfied. West of me, past the reed and hide lung I had stitched to push air one way, the 13th was crying, the unnumbered one, the child no chalk had counted, Yeva's, and the sound came to me down the same draft the surveyor tracked, thin and alive, and going the wrong direction up my tunnel. 2 clocks against 1 unfinished dig. The slower one was bringing mortar. You cannot outdig a man who walks faster than you bore, so you teach his instruments to lie. The surveyor read the dark the way I did, by what came back to him. He drove his sounding rod into the bedding, struck the cap, and counted the ring home. A void answered long and soft, solid rock came back short and bright, and where 2 stations crossed, their answers he boxed the hollow between them and called it found. I had no quarrel with his ear. I went to work on what reached it. 12 pairs of hands, 1 survey, 3 days of spoil banked wet in the tithe sumps, enough, if I spent it right, to change the rock's testimony before he ever struck it. We packed the real throat first. The western mouth where the channel breathed, we tamped reed by reed with sodden spoil until I laid the half-pick to it and heard nothing answer back. The note dead and stubby as a finger pressed on a full barrel. Then south, off a drift worked out a season gone, we opened a clean, false void and left it ringing. Wide, hollow, bright as a struck kettle in a cold room. Let his rod find that. Let him box a hollow that went nowhere and spend a station proving it empty. The decoy that mattered, we buried by collapsing it. We pulled the props of a spent drift in sequence and let the back come down measured, slow, course by course, so the next rod walk there would read a fresh fall, rock settling into its own grave, a void that had closed itself and owed the church no wall, no suffering left in it, nothing to seal, a seam the doctrine could cross off without a censer ever swinging. Then the keystone, and the keystone was theirs, not mine. There is a band in the 3rd gallery the vault calls a martyr's sweat, weeping salt that beads slow and amber, the kind the priests anoint and no iron is permitted to touch, holy rock, consecrated against the pick. I drove the true bore's last reach to run directly beneath it. The masons coming down to set their final course would kneel on bedding their own law forbade them to breach, and consecrate the lid of a road their faith had already sworn never to dig. I hit 100 meters of stolen daylight under a saint's sweat. Engineering and prayer, the same units, for once both on my side. It held for 9 hours. There was a trustee among us, a tallyman, a brand with a softer collar who counted heads for the church the way the church counted us, by the ton. The censors found him at the ramp mouth, and the holy thirst is patient with a frightened man. He gave them the western cash for a skin of water, and his own name struck off the lime. The oil, the dried reed, the banked grain Marta had hoarded a spoonful at a time. The zealots took it singing. Simon went down trying to hold the lamp oil, the youngest of the 12 I had trained to read lode through bone, and a zealot put the long iron through him before he could let go of the jar, his hands working open and shut after, slow, like gills pulling at air that would not feed them. I knelt and read the stillness the way I read everything. Then I changed the count, I do not chalk. 411. The plan had been weeks. Wall the spent seam ourselves, draw the breath west down the finished road, slip them out a handful a night into the cold, sweet draft, until the gallery the church judged dead came up empty in their hands. That plan died with Simon and the oil. The crossing was on the ramps, with its block and its lime. The surveyor was a station and a half out with his rod. The cash that would have fed a slow exodus was gone up the throat with men who thought they were balancing a ledger. No more weeks, no more quiet theft of meters while they prayed above us. One night to open the bore and run 400 souls down a hole the rock had only half agreed to, or no night at all. I crawled back to the false face to spend the figure against the dark, and that is when I heard the wrong sound come down the bedding. Not the rod, not the hymn. A pick. Bright. Testing. The tally man had not stopped at the cash. Broken men give everything. It is the only mercy left to them. He had told the censormen what the heretic hid and where. That the road I'd buried ran beneath the weeping vein, that the saint's sweat was a liar's roof, that the holy salt itself was the door. Up the gallery, by the light of a swung censer, an inquisitor laid his palm flat to the consecrated band the way I lay mine to wake the dark, and called for the long iron to be brought to the one rock I had staked the whole survey they would never, ever strike. The iron went up over the martyr's vein. 1 meter, 91 centimeters, the HUD chalked it, of unbroken salt between the true bore's last reach and the cold, sweet west I had only ever heard. 8 weeks of stolen rock, narrowed to a number a child could span with 2 open hands. Above me, the iron came down on the martyr's vein, and the holy salt rang like a cracked bell. Once, twice, the inquisitor learning by ear what I had buried under his own doctrine. Down the main shaft, the crossing's torches were moving. I could not see them. I could taste them, pitch smoke leaking ahead of the lime, the air going greasy at the back of the throat, the hymn coming down the bedding in slow waves that I felt in my teeth before I heard them. From the crown, a second sound, higher, a patient grinding where the cartel had read the tithe ledger and decided a dead seam was cheaper opened than walled, and had begun sinking a counterbore from the worked-out gallery above us, drilling down through 40 meters of evaporite toward the void they all wanted for different gods. 2 clocks had become 3, every one of them at 0. We had crowded 400 souls into a crawlway built for survey and single file. I felt them at my back the way you feel water against a cofferdam, not as faces, as load, as breath drawn from the same shrinking volume, lungful by lungful. 400 mouths and 1 bellows lung, pulling thin air down a hole that had not yet broken through to better. Yeva was 9 bodies back, with the 13th wrapped against her, and the child was not crying anymore, which was worse. Pavlo lay belly down at the face beside me with the long pry, waiting on my count. The crawl stretched behind us into dark I could not measure and would not chalk. The top right window woke amber and would not stay amber. Poor pressure. The one red I spent 2 lives learning to look at, the window I once let go dark while a crown loaded over 6 men who trusted a Schedule 1 signed, climbed past amber into red and sat there, steady and accusing, a wound that would not close. Vault stress bloomed across the overlay in the same color. The crown of salt above the final chamber lit up like a struck thumb. It creaked. Not the round complaint of rock settling, A dry tearing, fiber by fiber, the noise a green timber makes the instant before it decides. I had drawn this exact geometry once on a clean desk, an 11-degree shear holding a brine lens, and crossed it out in colored pencil to buy back 42 seconds. The desk was 2 lives gone. The shear was here, live, loaded, and I had walked 400 people in under it. Oxygen slid. I watched the figure go. 61, 60, 59. Bodies burning the gallery faster than the lung could feed it. The counter bore overhead, not yet through, but already promising a current I could not afford. Because the moment the cartel's bit kissed open air, the whole pressure scheme I'd balanced would invert, and the draft I had married to the west would reverse and run uphill into a drill hole, robbing the road of the very breath I had engineered to carry us down it. I quit looking at the number. Numbers you cannot lower will eat you. Pavlo's hand found my forearm in the dark and gripped, once, the way Marta presses a wall date into a palm. Not comfort, instruction. Now or not. I laid the half-pick flat to the last face and read it through the steel, the brine lens beyond singing its thin, trapped note, the bedding overhead ticking under the Inquisitor's iron, the whole loaded mass of the crown telling me in the only language I trust that it would hold for minutes, not hours, and that the minutes had teeth. I keep some counts unwritten, the air robbed from my own face, the souls under the crown I signed. I added the new one without chalk and without breath. 411. Simon's hands had worked open and shut after the iron, slow, like gills pulling at air that would not feed them. I had read that stillness an hour ago, and I read this one now. The crowns, the crawls, 400 lungs at 58%, in the same flat units because measuring is the only prayer that has ever answered me. The bore wanted 1 more meter. The rock wanted to close. The church wanted a lid, and the cartel wanted a hole. And the poor pressure window wanted, more than anything, to be looked at, finally, by a man who had once let it go dark. I looked at it. I held the pick to the salt and set my shoulders against 2 lives. Then the crown spoke its decision, all at once, a flat, percussive crack that was not the Inquisitor's iron and not the cartel's bit, that came from the loaded shear directly over 400 crowded backs, and the HUD threw the whole gallery to a screaming pulse of red, and somewhere behind me in the dark, a woman drew the breath that would have been a name and did not get to spend it. The snow took the overlay whole. 8 weeks of nursed load percentages dissolving to a gray hiss. The crown's clean geometry I had read a breath ago, smearing into static that climbed and would not crest. A whiteout poured straight into the one window I had finally taught myself to look at. The lines went first, then the numbers, then the dark behind the numbers, which is the part that does the killing. I knew this whiteout. Both my lives ended in it. The sheer above us was opening along the exact line I had once drawn in colored pencil and crossed out to buy back 42 seconds. 11 degrees, a brine lens cradled in the hinge, the same hand of rock that took 6 men through a crown I signed, proceed. And my body knew the shape of it before the helmet could, the way a burned palm knows the stove in pitch dark. The salt over 400 backs was choosing, fiber by dry fiber. I had heard this tearing before, through stolen seconds, with a boy's grip emptying in mine. Then the walls came in. Not the rock held. Minutes, the pick had sworn, minutes with teeth. What closed was inside the helmet, behind the eyes, the crawlway folding down to the bore of a throat, while 400 meters of evaporite I could suddenly feel stacked itself rib by rib along my spine. The dark pressing flat against my back, the way Slurry once pressed flat against a kid's chest while I counted his fingers letting go of mine. 1, then none. Count. That was the road I built, peg by peg. Quit the breath, count the strikes. Tap the prop head with the half pick and let a number live outside me, even and dumb and mine to set. The discipline that walked the snowed readout back down every time, the way a spooked animal follows a steady hand and never a kind voice. I reached for it now. I ordered my arm to lift the steel and strike the salt. It would not. The arm was stone. The hand had welded to the haft, knuckles gone the white of struck bone, and the blow I had driven through panic 100 times. A peg through the floor of myself would not come. Because the fear this time had got in under the discipline, found the breath I had stopped chasing, and the count I leaned on instead, and snowed them both at once. No breath to quit, no blow to throw. The whole machine I had made of myself, jammed at its one bearing, and me inside it like grit. Pavlo lay belly down at my hip with the long pry cocked against the last wafer of face, his whole weight loaded and waiting on the word I give. One word, the count that breaks 91 centimeters of married salt and lets the cold, sweet west pour uphill into 400 drowning lungs. His ear was turned to me where his eyes were no use. The cut was engineered, the angle, the depth, the keystone block I'd left thin on purpose. All of it sat ready under a hand that had stopped being mine. 91. I had the word. I could not spend it. Behind me 400 chests pulled at 58 and falling, and 9 bodies. Back Yeva held a child gone quiet against her collarbone, the unnumbered 13th, not crying, which I had read an hour ago as the worst sound a crawl can make, and read again now, and could do nothing with the reading. Old Marta's wall date was hours stale. The Inquisitor's iron ticked the bedding overhead, and somewhere the cartel's bit ground its last meters toward the void, where the instant it kissed open air, my draft would invert and run uphill into the drill hole, robbing the road of every breath I'd married to the path down. All of it I could measure, none of it I could move toward. Here is the count I never wrote, in 2 lives, because no chalk lies flat enough to hold it. A man can read the rock to its final fiber and stand inside the reading like a stopped clock, knowing the load, knowing the minutes, knowing the one cut that ends it waits under his own welded hand, and not lift the hand. I had buried 6 by looking away from the window. I was burying 400 by looking at it too well, frozen at the face I built. The only man alive who knew where to strike and how deep, and that knowing weighed nothing against a fist that would not open. Pavlo said my name, not the chalk number, the name. It reached me the way light reaches the bottom of a sump, bent, slowed, arriving as rumor of itself. I felt my mouth shape the count and stall on it. I felt the cold haft under my fist, ready, useless. Overhead, the crown tore another fiber and the static screamed up a register, white on white, and into that nothing I poured everything 2 lives had taught me, and it lifted not 1 gram of me. The man who could finish the cut could not move his hand. 400 breaths, 1 frozen, 0. The old man's hand came down over mine on the haft. He did not pull. 30 years in the deep stopes had taught his palms a fact none of my instruments ever logged. You do not warm a frozen man, you lend him a number. His thumb found the blue cord of my wrist and pressed, tapped. 1. Slow as the bellows cadence I drilled into the lung crew, slower, the count arriving from outside the helmet through a hand that had carried more men out by the wrists than it had ever managed to tally. And I took it the way the dead HUD once took my palm, borrowed, on credit, against a debt I could not yet read. 2. Around me the road went on working without its foreman. That was the thing I had built and never named. Not a tunnel, a crew, but a set of hands that could each hold 1 piece of the cut while the man at the center failed. Down the crawl behind us, the brine-married false-face took the Inquisitor's hammer, blow on patient blow, while old Marta drummed her knuckles against the wet salt in the rhythm of a gallery still paying its tithe, feeding the priest the suffering he came down to read, selling him a seam that wept on cue while the live one held its breath beside him. The lookouts passed her word forward in pick taps along the wall, knucklebone telegraph, 2 short for the hammer stroke and 1 long for the iron settling. Yeva worked the bellows. She worked it the way I taught her, hip-braced, both arms, pacing the draft down the channel and across the 13th slack mouth so the child drew on my road's last clean meters and not on the 58th that drowned the rest. The kid had gone quiet against her collarbone. Quiet, I'd read, as the worst sound a crawl makes. She rocked and pumped and did not stop to listen, because I had taught her that too, that the count is the prayer, and you do not break the cadence to grieve mid-stroke. 3. The old man's thumb lifted. Then he closed my fist for me, finger by finger, around the half-pick, and turned my face with his other hand toward the one place left in the world that was mine alone to enter. The slot. 91 centimeters of married salt, and the last of it tapered to a throat no wider than a man's shoulders driven sideways. The keystone block I'd shaved thin 8 weeks back against this exact hour. Pavlo's pry could not reach it. The old man's reach was gone in his shoulders. Only the foreman fit, the one body size to the cut, because the cut was sized to the work. I'd done with these arms, and the overlay that might have lit the keystone for me lay snowed, useless, white on white. A window I taught myself to read, gone blind at the reading. So I went in on nothing, on counted strikes, on the memory of 6 men I drowned to save 42 seconds, names I never carved and carry anyway, the boy whose fingers I counted out of mine, 1, then none. I wedged my shoulders into the throat where the salt pressed both ears at once, raised the steel to the length my elbow knew in the dark, and struck where the count said the keystone thinned. 4. The block rang wrong, too solid, off the mark a thumb's width. I shifted on the memory of the failed crown, the angle I'd read too late that other time, and struck again. 5. Behind me, the Inquisitor's hammer stopped. It stopped because the false face had told its last lie, or because a priest who reads galleries by how hard they suffer had finally heard one go quiet beside the weeping one. I did not turn. Marta drummed harder, selling, buying me strokes. 6. And the salt under the pick changed its voice, the dead ring going to a wet tearing, a fiber letting, the keystone shedding its first skin. 7. The block parted on a hairline, and through the hairline came a thread, cold, sweet, west. Clean night air off 400 meters of stone I had read and bored and married to this crawl, threading the slot against my cheek the way the first water finds a fault, and 400 drowning lungs behind me would not feel it yet, but I felt it, a single millimeter of the open dark pouring uphill into mine. I set the pick for the 8th strike, the one that opens the thread to a road. Overhead, the crown let go its minutes early. The salt I'd held at 40, the load the pick had sworn good for minutes with teeth, tore its last fiber while my arm was still rising, and the dark came down off the roof of the crawl with the flat sigh I had heard once before, in another life, through another helmet, pressing a chest that was not mine. One thread of night, one crown falling, me in the slot, alone, where no one else fit. The arithmetic of a falling roof is the shortest sum I know. Arms do not hold salt. You do not stop a crown. You choose the spot it comes to rest, and buy the seconds for everything you love to pass under first. So I stopped trying to rise into the 8th strike. I went down instead, head first into the las, into the throat that pressed both ears, into the one shape of dark a man drowned twice is wired to claw away from, and I clawed toward it. The slurry had taken me head-on in the other life. I met this the same way. Hands first, helmet first, spine bared to the crown. My palms found the 2 stub props I'd cached in the slot 8 weeks back. Dry timber no thicker than a forearm, set there for a job I had not let myself name. I jammed the first under the parting keystone where the count said the load ran heaviest, drove it with the heel of my hand, felt it bite and scream and take maybe a fifth of what was coming. The second I set against my own shoulder. Then I made the rest of the strut out of me. Knees locked into the floor salt, back arched under the shedding crown, the falling roof landing its first weight across my shoulder blades like a hand pressing a chest that this time was finally mine. Load at the prop, a fifth. Load on the man, the rest. Above me, the thread became a road. Pavlov's pry took the parted keystone and levered the throat from a slit to a gap to a mouth, and the cold, sweet west came down in a flood that smelled of nothing, of clean, of outside, of the absence of 400 breaths, and the first body came over my back, bare feet on my spine, a boy by the weight, scrambling, then gone up into the dark that was no longer roof, but door. I counted him. 1. They came across me like grit down a chute, heels and knees and dragging hands, the old salt cutter shoving them up and through, 100 souls reading the foreman like a floor, and never knowing the floor had a name and a brand and a debt it was paying in full. The crown sifted onto my neck, fine as flour through a sieve. I held the count under it because the count was the only prayer that ever answered. 200, 240, the prop screaming, my arms past arithmetic, and into the place where you simply do not let go. Yeva came over me with the bellows lashed to her back, and the 13th at her collarbone. She did not stop. I had taught her that. The child drew its slack, quiet mouthful of west air an arm's length above my buried face, and somewhere past the gap, a sound I had read as the worst a crawl makes broke open into a thin, furious wail. The unnumbered one, screaming because there was, at last, enough air to scream with. 300. The prop split. I took its fifth onto the rest of me and did not fall. Through the mouth I could see what I had bored toward for 2 lives and never once seen, the paleo channel running west and up, breathing, and beyond its far lip a hole punched out under open sky. Desert, black, a cold I had only ever read as a draft, and over it stars scattered like rivets cooling in black steel, past the Theocracy's wall, past every ton they ever counted us by. The last of them ran for it. Old Marta, Pavlo, the lookouts who had telegraphed by knuckle. The salt cutter went last, and at the gap he turned, and through the throat he tapped my shoulder once with his thumb. 1 long, the iron settling, the signal for done. 412 souls over my back and out under the stars. I had buried 6 by shaving 42 seconds. I had nearly buried 400 by looking too long at a window that snowed white at the reading. Here, blind, the overlay dead, and the numbers gone, and only the count my crew lent me through a wrist, I held the thing I could not fix on the one instrument I had never trusted, and now had nothing left to be, my own body, turned to a strut, the claustrophobe become the roof. The crown came down for good. It came the way it came in the other life, with the flat sigh, the salt closing over a man head first in the dark. But the dark above the salt was empty now, swept clean, 412 mouths breathing a desert no priest had blessed and no boss had bored. The road I drowned 6 men failing to build, I finished with my back. Count it. 0 left under the crown but me. The drill that came to wall us in broke through 3 hours late and tasted wind running the wrong way out of the rock. I knew the counterbore by its pitch before I knew it by anything. A cartel rig, diamond head, the kind that bills by the meter and grinds salt to talc. And it came down through the hanging wall on the line the church had bought. A clean shot meant to drop on top of 400 breathing tons and find them packed and ready for the slate. It found a hole. The wind told it first. Air that should have sat dead in a sealed gallery leaned on the bit and went west, and the rig's note climbed half a tone the way a man's voice climbs when the floor he trusted isn't under his next step. The crossing came after, on foot, the way the church always enters a worked seam, censors ahead, then the count priest with his slate, then the lamps that wake a brand by its number and read a man down to the ton he weighs. I lay under the crown in my pocket of bad air, the split prop holding its last fifth a finger off my cheek, and I listened to them walk into the absence I had built. Boots on swept floor, a long quiet. The count priest's stylus, scratching at nothing, because nothing was there to tally, and a tally is the only word he owns. Brine had already begun on the proof. The seep we cut to flood the lower drift ran back across the gallery and lifted the marks, the knuckle scuffs, the heel prints stacked toward the gap, the long score where Yeva's bellows dragged, and softened them the way a flood tide takes a name scratched above the rack line. By the second shift, the floor would heal smooth. Rock forgets faster than any ledger. What it would not give back was the throat overhead, the parted keystone, the road punched west and up into a cold no censor had ever blessed. The holing through was the part he could not file. Two faces, mine and the dead channels, brought to a kiss across 8 years and a wall of men no one fed. The slap of breakthrough that every bore boss waits a career to feel once and most never do. He read the meeting on his overlay and read it true. The angle held to a hair. The throat opened on the keystone and not the haunch. The line walked dead west when the seam wanted it down. Impossible on the timber, routine on the math, if you were willing to be the timber. He came in last, the other surveyor, the cartels, and I knew him by his silence the way you know a man by his cough across a dark face. His overlay woke the same as mine once had. I could not see it, buried, but I could read him reading it. The slow turn, the stop, the held breath of a man whose instrument is telling him a thing his hands refuse. He stood where the load ran heaviest. He knelt at the stub props. He laid his glove on the dry timber I'd cached 8 weeks back and felt through the wood the fifth it had carried. And he did the figure no priest in that gallery could do, because a priest counts what is, and a surveyor counts what held. I had run the same sum 100 nights against the slot wall with a nail. Crown load at breakthrough, more than any timber I owned. Props to hand? 2, and bad. The gap between what the roof shed and what dry wood could take was a number with a body's weight in it, exactly. And he found that weight missing from the props and present in the survey, and understood, kneeling, that the variable I had closed the road with was the one he would never let himself carry. A man set into the equation where a beam should go, and balanced. He stayed down longer than the work wanted. His lamp did not move. The Count Priest read the loss to the gallery in the flat tone they keep for fallen stock. No bodies, no brands to scrape and ship, no tonnage to weigh against the rolls. He marked the seam closed, and the souls beneath it the only way his slate allowed, and his stylus made the small, dry sound a stylus makes setting down a thing that is not true. Lost to fall, the slate said, 412. 12 over 400 who were, at that hour, drawing desert. The surveyor knew it and held his tongue, because no column on any slate the church or the cartel keeps has a line for a road bored by a man who let the roof land on him on purpose. No unit for 42 seconds, once shaved into 6 graves and now spent the long way around to walk a gallery empty. He would carry the figure out of the salt and never once spend it. I lay in my pocket of held air with the prop a finger off my cheek and did the last arithmetic the way I have done all of it, flat, in the dark, for no one. They wrote 412 into the ground, and the ground held 1. The ledger that branded us by the ton struck the wrong names tonight and called it a cave-in, and the stroke that erased them was the only manumission a priest will ever sign without knowing his own hand did it. Crossed out, gone west, free on the single page that swears they died. What reaches a buried man first is not air, but a hand. And the hand that closed on my wrist came down the road I had aimed west, against the wind, against every reason, into a throat sized for one body passing, and not for two. Yeva's grip. I knew the bellows callus on her thumb before I knew the dark had a top again. She had walked the freed line out into the open, counted heads in the cold, come up one short, and turned around, back into the salt, for the figure that didn't balance. They cut the split prop away a fiber at a time, because a fall that has found its rest will move again if you ask it wrong. and I lay still and read the load off them the way I'd once read it off timber, breath by breath, while a thread of gray came down the bore from somewhere I had only ever calculated. Dawn, run backward into rock. It pooled on the swept floor like water finding level in a vial. First light I had owned in 8 years, and it arrived measured, down a line I'd surveyed to a hair. The crown had shed its load onto wood at last, and the wood had taken it, held. The throat climbed at the angle I'd given it, west and up, and they passed me hand to hand through the keystone gap into a cold no censor had blessed and no slate kept a column for. Sand, not salt. The grit of it on my tongue tasted wrong and clean at once. A kestrel hung over the wash on a held wing, reading the ground for the smallest movement the way I read rock for the first hairline of fracture. And beneath it, the freed line lay in the lee of a dune with their lamps hooded, 411 of them breathing desert in the blue dark before the sun. Nobody spoke. Speaking is for men who think they're owed an answer. I made them, line by brand, and walked the row with the count priest's own arithmetic turned inside out, lamp to forearm, waking each number off the scar the church had burned to weigh us, not to tally what was lost, but to prove what stood. 411 coals answered in the gray. Then Yeva, 412, her thumb still raw from the bellows. Then a thing I had not done across 8 years of counting other men into the ground, and almost never out of it. I turned the lamp on my own arm, read the brand the church gave a surveyor it was sure it had buried, and set that number in the living column instead of the lost. 413. We were not a crew after that, and not stock either. A trade had come up out of the dark with us. Every hand on that dune could shore adrift, smell a seep, true a face to within a finger of true west, because I had taught it to them, in whispers stretched thin across 8 years. The way you teach men to outlive a thing you mean to do once and never repeat. They knew the route now, the dead channels, the pockets of bad air, the places the cartel's diamond rigs would come hunting once the seam read empty. They knew the oldest secret a surveyor owns, which is only this, that the bones of the earth will answer any man patient enough to put the question in millimeters and wait. The sun came over the rim and put an edge on every face, and I watched 412 people who had been weighed by the ton learn what their own shadows looked like. The vault would go on counting its salt by tonnage, and the cartel its by the body. Neither weather knows it has been robbed until the next shipment comes light. Somewhere beneath both of them ran roads only we could read. We had carried the war up into the air with us, folded small, kept dry, the way I'd cached the timber. My overlay woke last, the way it always did, smearing its survey ghost across open sky where it had nothing left to tag. No shoring, no load percentage, no fault gouge bleeding red, only the long, clean gradient of a desert that owed me nothing and threatened me with the same. Oxygen at 100. The number sat there and would not fall. For 8 years, the HUD had screamed at me in red about the air I had left, the alarm I'd learned to breathe straight through, and now it simply stopped. The dial steady, the noise gone out of the world, and the silence weighed more than any roof I ever set my body under. I let it weigh. Then I turned east, toward the vault's first shaft and the 400 still written alive in its rolls, and I began to measure the next way down.